Greetings, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I am making this webcast in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and so let me start by extending my deepest sympathy and expressing my solidarity to all those who are suffering or who have suffered, and to their loved ones in the course of this pandemic. May I also take the opportunity to extend my thanks to the health workers, both here at WIPO in the organisation, but throughout the world, who are doing such a wonderful job and exhausting work, and we are all deeply in your gratitude. Similarly, I should like to express our deep gratitude to all of the cleaners and the cleaning staff here at WIPO, but throughout the cities of the world who are helping to keep the environment safe for us, and indeed to all the emergency teams at WIPO and throughout the world, in all the cities of the world, who are helping to keep us functional at some risk themselves in the midst of this crisis. Let me now turn to the agenda for today. Usually at this time of the year we release our results for the preceding year at WIPO. So that will be the first item on the agenda. I'll speak about 2019, which was the year that was. It was a very, very good year for the World Intellectual Property Organization. Of course, we're in a very different situation in 2020, but 2019 we have the results, and I shall give you those in one moment. I'll then move to some of the program challenges and highlights for the year 2020, which is underway, of course. And then I should like to address finally the crisis management at WIPO, how we are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact it's having on our operations, and what sort of impact it might have in the future on our finances. So let me start with our financial results for 2019. It was an extremely good year for the organisation. We ended the year with an overall surplus of 98 million Swiss francs. That was on revenue of some 457 million and on expenditure of about 401 million Swiss francs. Included in the overall surplus of 97.7 million, which is an excellent result for the organisation, was an investment gain on our investments, our reserves, of 42.1 million Swiss francs. I signal that because it's not part of our current operations, as it were, and because it can easily go the other way. Indeed, in the preceding year, in 2018, we had investment losses amounting to 15.3 million Swiss francs. So this is a factor which is a constant in our financial situation. I just point it out because we're subject there to market forces rather than our own performance. The bottom line, overall, 2019, a great year, nearly 100 million Swiss francs surplus. That graph which you are seeing now gives you the picture of the evolution of the financials of the organisation in the course of the last 10 years. You see that following the global financial crisis, we suffered. There was a loss incurred in 2010, 2011. But that subsequently we've benefited from the expansion that's occurred throughout the world economy, and in particular in the field of intellectual property, which I shall come back to in one moment. Last year, of course, was the best year that we've experienced in the course of the last decade, well, in the history of the organisation, actually. As a consequence of this expansion that we've seen in the course of the last 10 years, the organisation is in a very stable position financially and has a very solid financial situation. So you see that the net assets of the organisation have continued to rise. On that graph, which you can see, the liquid assets of the organisation, which is the green line, have been going up, and that is a deliberate policy that we have pursued to augment the liquid assets of the organisation in order to ensure that we are in a good position for an event such as the current COVID-19 pandemic. That overall financial picture and the very good position in which we find ourselves is, of course, a consequence of the expansion of demand for intellectual property, generally speaking, worldwide, which we've seen as a feature of the environment for the last decade, but in particular for the intellectual property services of the organisation. We have a number, as many of you are aware, of global IP systems, and we've seen significant growth in those in the course of 2019. So in our Patent Cooperation Treaty, which, by the way, is the source of 75% of the revenue of the organisation, we experienced some 5.2% growth in 2019 over 2018. Some 266,000 international patent applications were filed and processed by the organisation. In our Madrid system, which is international registration of trademarks, a good year also, 5.7% growth on a total of 64,400 international trademark application. And our design system, the Hague system for the international registration of designs, which is the least mature of our systems for historical reasons and has the least geographical participation, some 64 member states, as opposed to the Patent Cooperation Treaty, where we have 153 member states participating. But nevertheless, it's a growing system, very much in growth, 21,000, nearly 22,000 designs filed for registration internationally. It was a 10% increase over the preceding year. Let me look at those figures now individually in a little bit more detail. And by the way, these slides will be available on our website and indeed will be supplemented by some further slides to which I do not have time to refer this morning. So now the Patent Cooperation Treaty, you see there the growth over the period of the last 10 years, 5.2%, as I mentioned, for 2019, but a steady growth really over the course of the last 10 years since the global financial crisis and its fallout. The top filer, that is the top source of international patent applications filed under the Patent Cooperation Treaty, became for the first time last year China in 2019. So this is an historic event. Since the inception of the system some 40 years ago, the United States of America has been the top source of international patent applications under the PCT. Last year, China passed the United States of America, 58,990 compared to 57,840. It's an historical event. Congratulations to China, which has done this in a very short period of time. So on the graph that you can see there, you see the blue line, the blue bar, represents the number of international patent applications sourced from the particular country 10 years ago in 2009. The red bar represents the number of international patent applications sourced from the country in 2019. So you see extraordinary growth from China, of course, but very impressive growth equally from the United States of America, from Japan, and so on throughout the countries mentioned. One of the things to notice, besides this rise of China, is that in general, Asia, as a source of international patent applications, is occupying a very different position from the one which it occupied merely 10 years ago. And there on this graph you can see that Asia is now the source of more than 50%, 52.4% indeed, of all international patent applications filed under our Patent Cooperation Treaty system. 52.4%. And you can see the relative decline of the United States of America and Europe as a share of the total number of international patent applications. Now, the way I think to look at this relative decline is it's a relative decline of share, not of absolute numbers at all. There has been good growth in both of those regions in the use of the international patent system. But there has been the arrival of a new competitor and a new source of international patent applications, namely Asia, which we've seen in the course of the last 10 years go from some 33% of all international patent applications to 52.4%. Very significant development, of course. Moving to the area of trademarks, in our Madrid system, as we call it, for international trademark registrations, good growth. There has been good growth again since the global financial crisis. You see it there on the graph, and 5.7% growth last year. The source countries, where are these international trademark applications coming from? They're coming first, the first source is the United States of America, which you can see there is quite a long way out in advance as the primary source of international trademark applications, followed by Germany, China, France, and Switzerland, and so on. And you will see again the comparison between the position 10 years ago and the position in 2019. Designs, the final of our major global IP systems. As I mentioned, a newer system in some respects, and with a reduced geographical participation, but nevertheless very much in expansion. And you see that there reflected on that graph, with 10.4% increase in the number of designs for which registration was sought internationally. In terms of designs and sources of the design applications, Germany is the largest user of this international filing system, followed by Korea, the Republic of Korea, Switzerland, Italy, and so forth. We see some interesting evolutions in that area. Whereas traditionally designs were for automobiles, for furniture, for watches, for luxury goods, we see that one of the biggest sectors in which design protection is sought these days is the ICT, information and communications technology, smartphones, for example, industry. So this is a big evolution, and it reflects what you're seeing there in terms of the sources of applications. In addition to our systems for patents, trademarks, and designs, we also, through the WIPO Arbitration and Mediation Centre, provide dispute resolution services for disputes in the area of intellectual property. This is another growth area. It's not necessarily a great thing that there's growth in the number of disputes, but it reflects the overall activity in the field of intellectual property. So the results are given there on a very busy slide, and I will not go through it in detail. I'll leave it for those of you who wish to look at it in detail afterwards, simply to say that we have a growing number of arbitrations, mediations, and expert determinations for intellectual property disputes. Growth of 16% last year to 62 cases. Some of these cases have a rather small value in dispute, and some of them have an enormous value in dispute, running into billions of dollars. And the parties, it's a very international procedure, the parties coming from 23 countries, and so a very good performance there of the Arbitration and Mediation Centre. The Arbitration and Mediation Centre also administers a dispute resolution procedure, the Uniform Dispute Resolution Procedure for Internet Domain Name Disputes, the abuse of the registration of a domain name by cyber squatting a trademark registration. We've administered over the years some 47, nearly 50,000 such disputes since the inception of this procedure. The number has been rising as indeed the use of domains and the domain name system rises throughout the world. Last year, some 3,693 internet domain name disputes, a growth of about 7%. It's to be noted that we not only provide this dispute resolution service in the so-called generic top-level domains, that's .com, .org, and so on, all of the domains that are not associated with a particular country. But we also provide it, in addition to the generic top-level domains, for country code top-level domains like .ch for Switzerland. Indeed, we are providing it for 78 countries, dispute resolution services for internet domain name disputes in the country code top-level domain. Moving on from our global systems, we see that there has been much increased interest in intellectual property throughout the world in the course of the last decade in particular, but this has been growing for a longer period of time. And that is reflected in many ways, but the demand, increase in demand is one way, but it's also reflected in the increase in interest in participation in this organization. So we administer some 26 multilateral treaties here, which were developed within the organization by the member states. And the number of accessions to those treaties continues to rise. So last year was a record year for the number of accessions, with some 55 states acceding to treaties, different treaties, or 55 accessions to different treaties of WIPO. And a lot of this is in the field of copyright. That's the major area of activity with our internet treaties of 1996, plus the Beijing Treaty on audiovisual performances, protecting actors' performances, and the Marrakesh Treaty making or facilitating access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me move then to a different sector of the organization's activities, namely our data and digital services. We have a number of electronic platforms. I'm not going to go into these in great detail, but simply to say we have quite a significant number of electronic platforms which are used by millions of users throughout the world every day, as a matter of fact. We have developed, in the course of the last 2 years, a single IP portal for all of our global services, and that's something that we will continue to work on to make the user experience more intuitive and more friendly for all of our systems, and more uniform as well. We have a number of very significant databases which have associated with them a number of very interesting tools, some of them based on artificial intelligence technology, such as image searching, automatic image searching, or translation, automated translation based on a deep neural network and deep learning. In the area of technology, we have over 80 million documents available in our database. For brands, over 40 million documents. For designs, 11 million. And for laws around the world, which is a source that's used by many students and many universities, as well as practitioners, over 40,000 electronic copies or texts of IP laws and treaties and regulations from nearly 200 countries are available through our database. I mentioned the artificial intelligence tools that we have developed in the organization internally through a centre which we established 2 years ago, the Advanced Technologies Application Centre. We've had some very successful AI applications. One is WIPO Translate, which is available for 10 languages, and about 2.5 million words are translated around the world through this AI application. And it's an extremely important way of having access to technology which is being published in, for example, Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Russian or any other language, as a matter of fact, of the 10 for which the application works at the moment. Brand image search, which I've mentioned already, and this is widely used. We have started to deploy for our meetings at WIPO a speech-to-text AI-based system, which is replacing the rather laborious process of producing verbatim reports of meetings. And we are using this technology, AI-based technology, for classification systems as well. We will launch in 2020 a new digital service. We're calling it WIPO Proof. It's a digital timestamp which we believe will be of great utility in furnishing a proof or evidence of the existence of data at a certain period of time. And this has wide applications across the creative industries. It has wide applications, for example, for technology that is protected through trade secrecy. A lot of our platforms also are directed at capacity building and development cooperation. I mentioned a few here on this slide, some of the most popular ones. We are providing the basic operating system for IP administration in 87 countries, IP offices throughout all of the regions of the world, mainly developing and least developed countries. We provide a centralized access to work sharing done by an office, so that if a similar or the same application is filed in a second office or a third office, the work that has already been done becomes available through our case or centralized access to search and examination system. And we have now 33 offices participating in this, 20 of which are developing countries. We have had great success in establishing technology and innovation support centres. There are over 900 such centres that have been established in 80 national networks throughout the world. And this is a very popular mechanism for access to passive technology contained in the databases that we have, but also other commercial databases which are made available on a free access basis to least developed countries and a moderate price basis to developing countries by commercial database vendors, as well as an extremely important contribution of similar free and moderate priced access for scientific, technical and medical journals published throughout the world. These are very important partnerships. This is a very busy slide, so I leave it for you, for those who wish, to look at it afterwards. But it's just to say that in the area of the creative industries, of course, digital platforms are one of the primary, if not the primary, means of the distribution of creative works, be they music or audiovisual, films, television productions, and so on, throughout the world now. In order to have a presence on a digital platform, of course, the works have to be digitized, and they have to be indexed and standardized or conform to certain standards to make their manipulation and dealing with them and treatment and their availability easy. So we are working through a program called WIPO Connect in developing countries to digitize their platforms, their creative works collections that are administered collectively in a collective management organization. This is well underway for music. We're extending it to other varieties of creative works, and we hope that this will be a real service in enabling developing countries and the many, many talented performers and artists and authors and composers from developing countries to have access to some of the major digital platforms that we're all familiar with and that we all use for the distribution of creative works. Let me say one word about, and again, a very busy slide, so I leave it for those who wish to explore it afterwards. The way we advance our program at WIPO. Innovation, of course, is one of the main reasons for which we have intellectual property. And so not only is it important to provide services that facilitate life for innovators throughout the world, but it's very important that we as an organisation remain innovative. And this slide gives you a summary, if you're interested, in some of the innovations that are going on at WIPO. We have 36 initiatives, actually, which are demonstrating innovation at WIPO. And we're investing quite significantly in this area. In the course of the last 2 years, 52 million Swiss francs invested in new products and services, all part of, let me say, the digital transformation of the organisation, which, by the way, has placed us in a much more resilient position for the current COVID-19 pandemic and for remote working and remote connections with all of our constituents throughout the world. Not only are we innovating, but we, of course, measure innovation throughout the world through our Global Innovation Index, which we run in partnership with INSEAD and with the Cornell University Business School. And here is a slide that will demonstrate the take-up of the Global Innovation Index worldwide. It's become the primary reference source for measuring innovation capacity and performance throughout the world. We publish it on an annual basis, and you'll see some of the statistics of the take-up of this for policymakers throughout the world. We are also using remote access technology, namely distance learning technology, in the WIPO Academy, which runs more than 19 courses on distance learning and a series of other courses for capacity building in the field of intellectual property. And you see that this has really taken off. And last year we had a steep rise, as we did in the preceding year, in the number of participants in our distance learning programs. We have over 120,000 users worldwide from a wide variety of countries of these programs. That, very briefly, is just to show you the means of access that people are using. So the red part of the bar is mobile access on mobile platforms and mobile telephones. The blue is the light blue is access via traditional desktops, and the dark blue is access via tablets. We have several public-private partnerships. I've already mentioned the ones we have with publishers, making available free and moderate cost publications to least developed countries and developing countries. We also have two others that I would like to mention in particular, and we have yet another that I won't have time to mention, the Accessible Books Consortium. So our Marrakesh Treaty, which, by the way, is receiving the highest number of accessions, and is covering nearly 100 countries now throughout the world, and we want to get to universality on the Marrakesh Treaty. The Marrakesh Treaty provides the legal framework for the cross-border transfer of publications, books, and other forms of printed text, educational texts, novels, all forms of text, scientific works, government texts, and so forth. The Accessible Books Consortium takes up that facility to be able to have a cross-border transfer and enables the transfer actually to take place. It's one thing having the facility, it's another thing using it. So this is a consortium of authors, publishers, libraries,
the World Blind Union, rights-owning organisations, and blind associations throughout the world, which is very successful. And let me mention that we have 71 libraries for the blind throughout the world who are using this facility. We have a total catalogue of 620,000 accessible works in 80 languages. Over 500,000 of those are available for free exchange without any formalities for rights clearance as a consequence of the Marrakesh Treaty, and that's the importance of countries acceding to the Marrakesh Treaty, because they then become eligible for this formalities-less exchange of the significant number of works that are made available throughout the world. We also promote through this consortium, in close cooperation with the publishers, the International Publishers Association, inclusive publishing, that is, books that are born accessible, that when they're published not just for a seeing audience, but also for an audience of blind persons and visually impaired persons. And we've had over 100 publishing houses around the world signing up to this ideal of born accessible. We're also involved in capacity building. We have projects in 17 countries to build the possibility of accessible books for the blind populations in those countries. There are some 12,700 educational titles, primary school, secondary school, tertiary educational titles that we've been able to make available in accessible formats in local languages. And a lot of this as a consequence of the generosity of the Australian government, which has financed this particular project. Another public-private partnership we have is WIPO Research, which is a consortium of pharmaceutical companies, universities, public health institutes, and other research institutions throughout the world. So we have 147 organisations or entities that are subscribing to or participating in WIPO research. The aim is to share on a free basis, intellectual property and unpublished scientific data in the fields of neglected tropical diseases, malaria and tuberculosis, for the purpose of accelerating drug discovery in those areas. And pharmaceutical companies and other universities and other research institutions are prepared to do this because, of course, research and neglected tropical diseases affect the poorest populations in the world and those who have no purchasing power. And so it's a sort of form of market failure where we need this cooperation. There have been 139 or so, 150 collaborations of sharing libraries of compounds and other scientific data between the various participants of this consortium and some of the very best research institutions in the world. Let me move to say a word about our communications. We have very active communications. We are trying to modernise all the time. And this slide will give you, if you would like to care to look at it afterwards, some indication of the extent of our presence on social media as well as our traditional presences, but the extent of our presence on social media, some of the products that we have, and the widespread use or consumption of our offerings throughout the world on these different platforms. A word about World Intellectual Property Day, which is celebrated each year in the month of April. This year, it will not be celebrated physically, of course, around the world. It'll be a virtual celebration. We choose a different theme every year. The theme this year is green innovation, innovation for a green economy. Prior to this year, we noticed that there has been a steady uptake around the world, with some 600 plus events organised in 136 countries. As I said, this year it'll be a virtual celebration. So much for 2019. There are a lot of other things that went on in the organisation that I simply do not have time to go through now. We'll make available a larger slide pack which will give some further details to you. But let me move to my two other topics for this morning. The first is 2020. How is it presenting? And what are some of the major challenges and highlights for the organisation in 2020? Well, the first, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic crisis management. I will come back to that separately in one moment, but that is, of course, at the moment the major preoccupation of the organisation remaining functional. Of course, another preoccupation throughout the year will be maintaining the good systems and platforms that we have for our global IP systems, the PCT, Madrid, The Hague, dispute resolution, indeed the Lisbon Agreement that I'll come to in one moment for geographical indications. This is a major, of course, always a major preoccupation of the organisation. It is the source of over 90%, 92% of the revenue of the organisation, so extremely important that these function well, and there's a constant focus on those systems. I mentioned earlier that we will be introducing a new digital service, a digital timestamping, WIPO proof, at the end of the month of April, and we look forward to seeing the take-up of that. We have been promoting a discussion or a conversation internationally about artificial intelligence and intellectual property policy. We had a very successful meeting on this last year, following which we launched for public comment a list of issues that we considered arise for intellectual property policy as a consequence of artificial intelligence. And it ranges from anything from, for example, the notion of authorship and the notion of machine creation or machine innovation or machine invention or machine creation, and to what extent our classical intellectual property systems are adapted for this, and to what extent and how are different countries dealing with these questions. Also, it ranges, it covers questions such as the use of copyrighted data to feed an algorithm, an artificial intelligence algorithm, to develop, for example, new music or new creative works, new paintings. And not only is there an authorship question there, but there is a question of the extent to which that is permissible, with an overriding policy imperative around the world of the free exchange of data, but with certain exceptions to that, for example, for personal data or privacy, but also for copyright. So these are the sorts of questions we're exploring. We put out last year the list of issues. We received over 250 comments from governments, from private individuals, from corporations, from research institutions throughout the world. And we're at the moment in the process of refining that list of issues, which we will republish as a revised list. And we hope that in the course of this year that we will hold a second conversation to help everyone understand the fundamental questions that are arising for intellectual property policy and thus innovation policy and creative industries policy as a consequence of the acceleration in the use of AI applications as a general purpose technology throughout the whole of the economy. That meeting, that second conversation, was to have taken place in May. We will still be under a shutdown in May, and so we will reschedule it for later in the year. As I mentioned earlier, we are working on a number of AI applications, specific applications. I mentioned the ones that we have already developed. There are new ones under development too. which will generally improve our business competitiveness, but it will also make life easier for the intellectual property community throughout the world. A big event this year is the entry into force of two treaties, namely the Geneva Act of the Lisbon Agreement, which, as a consequence of the accession of the European Union in 2019, will enter into force in 2020. This is a big event. It is a revision of the classical arrangement that we had for the international registration and protection of appellations of origin, and the extension of that arrangement to geographical indications throughout the world. So this is an important addition to our global IP systems. Also entering into force this year is the Beijing Treaty for the protection of audiovisual performances, for the protection of actors, basically, and their performances, throughout the world. So this is another major event which we will celebrate in the course of the year. Some years ago, we held a conference on the global digital content market, which has developed in the course of the last 10 and 20 years. We've been encouraged by stakeholders in the various creative industries to revisit this, because a lot of things have happened in the 4 or so years since we held the first edition of this conference. One of those things is, as I've mentioned, artificial intelligence and its use in the creative industries, in production and in distribution, in all of the creative industries. There are many other developments that have occurred, of course, in this market for digital content worldwide. So this will be a big event which we'll hold in the month of September, we are hoping. Now, one of the impacts you'll see of the current crisis is that no physical meetings are taking place. That, of course, is a big obstacle to the further development of our normative or rule-making agenda, which already is confronted by a number of obstacles throughout the world, such as the challenges, various challenges to multilateralism. We nevertheless hope that despite the absence of meetings, we may go forward with the proposed design law treaty this year. There are other items on the agenda, as you're all aware, broadcasting, traditional knowledge, and so on. They really require further physical meetings for development, but the design law treaty is probably ready without any further physical meetings. We are working with both the United Nations office in Geneva and with the Swiss authorities and the Geneva authorities in particular on the development of a crèche which would be available for children of WIPO employees, but also UN employees, other international agencies, and indeed local communities. It's not going to be able to serve the whole of Geneva, of course. It's one particular addition to the infrastructure that already exists in Geneva, and this we hope to see advanced throughout the year, but it's at an early stage. I think we are called by the current crisis to consider, because when you consider the impact of this crisis, one of the greatest impacts has been on our development services. A lot of those depended on physical presence, physical meetings, and so we need to pay some attention to electronic delivery, or further attention, more attention to electronic delivery of development services. I mentioned our distance learning programs. I mentioned a number of other platforms that we have, such as the intellectual property automation system that's being widely used in 87 countries for their intellectual property administration, our case system. We already have a number of electronic platforms for the delivery of development services, but we need to focus a little more as a consequence of the current crisis on this. And then finally, let me mention that, of course, in 2020, it'll be a year of transition in the leadership of the organisation. My mandate finishes on September 30, 2020. let me here reiterate my warmest congratulations to Mr. Darren Tang for the outstanding victory that he had in the Coordination Committee, which has nominated him to be the next Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization. That nomination of the Coordination Committee needs to be confirmed by the General Assembly of WIPO, which we hope will take place in the course of the month of May at a meeting that is scheduled. And now finally, let me come to crisis management. So we've received a lot of inquiries from member states, from stakeholders in particular throughout the world, as to the impact of the current crisis, and I'll deal with four elements of it, really. The first is, what's the current situation? So the current situation for this organisation is that we are operating remotely. And that transition took place several weeks ago, and it has been a successful transition, and let me communicate to you, a very successful transition. For this, I should like to extend my deep gratitude to all of the staff of WIPO who have adapted to this in a really outstanding manner. I think we were well placed, relatively well placed as an organisation for this transition for two reasons. First, most of our services are delivered electronically. So the Patent Cooperation Treaty, the Madrid system, the Hague system, our arbitration and dispute resolution system, many of our development platforms are all electronic. So there has been no interruption to our provision of services under these systems. We're operating at 90+% capacity in all of these systems. And it has been relatively, and I underline the relatively, because it's a big transition, relatively seamless to be able to achieve this. Of course, there's been a huge amount of work that has gone into this, to go from a physical enterprise or organisation to a remote, wholly remote working organisation. We do have an emergency team, which is present physically, and we have tried to reduce this to the least number of persons in order to respect all of the directions and recommendations of our host country, Switzerland, and the sound medical practice. We, I think, are very grateful to our emergency team. It's the smallest possible number that we can deal with for buildings, security, and so forth, and our IT, our various systems. It has been successful. We have regular meetings, virtually of course, of our crisis management team and our senior management team. And both of those teams have really done a splendid job in looking after the management of the transition. So I think the message that I would give you is that we're fully operational. Not fully, but almost fully operational. We're fully operational. I'll come to where we're not. We're fully operational in our services that are delivered on electronic platforms, and this thanks to really outstanding work, if I may say, on the part of the staff of this organisation. Now, what have been other impacts on our operations? Well, as I said, services okay. Meetings don't take place. So we postponed or cancelled all meetings that were scheduled for the months of March and April, and we'll be extending that to the month of May, with the exception of the General Assembly, which will be dealt with exceptionally. But for all other meetings, they're not taking place. Similarly, missions, travel, is not taking place. So March, April, May, and then we review this constantly, and we'll see where we're placed in about 2 weeks' time for the month of June. So it's a constant vigilance that we exercise in this regard. I think the biggest impact has been on our meetings and thus on our normative agenda, the possibility of discussions amongst all of the member states going forward in particular areas to a more mature stage in the various elements of our rulemaking program that we have. This is obviously a major impact which I'm afraid just is not taking place at the moment. I think there has been an impact also on our development services. As I mentioned, we have very important electronic development services such as our distance learning programs and all of the other platforms that are widely used, our TISC program, Technology and Innovation Support Centres. However, travel to countries and the inevitable dialogue that takes place as a consequence of this is suffering in the current crisis. We're very much aware of this. And we're looking at various means to improve our communications with the developing countries and the least developed countries, the countries in transition, to ensure as much as possible that we can keep functioning and keep delivering the services that may be requested of the organisation in this regard. And as I said, a big focus will be how we can improve in our electronic delivery of some of these services, because the world is going to be a different place, of course, after we emerge from this current crisis, and a lot of things will take place differently. So that's, I think, a summary of the major impact. Now, what about the impact financially? As I said, over 90%, 92% roughly, of our revenue is derived from the services that we render. Well, operationally, as I mentioned, there will be no impact on those services. We're operating, we're in business, and over 90% capacity, and we'll get to 100% capacity very shortly. So operationally, no impact. But of course, what is the impact of the inevitable global economic recession that we are all going to experience? Well, look, a few words on this. We are totally dependent on the market. So you saw in the graphs that I showed you previously that after the global financial crisis in the end of 2008 and in 2009, we did experience a significant reduction in the demand for our services because economic activity slowed down worldwide and there was a major recession. What we don't know at this stage is how deep and how long this crisis will go for, and the consequence, how deep and long will be the economic disruption as a consequence. What we can say is that traditionally, if this were a traditional economic recession, the sort of impact that we would see is a fairly immediate impact on our trademark services, because trademarks are new brands that represent new enterprises and new products and services. Well, that obviously is going to go down, and so when there is an economic recession, there is an almost immediate impact on our Madrid system. That's 17% of our income. Usually, in the traditional recession, we would see the impact on our international patent system 12 months after the onset of the crisis. And this is because the normal pattern for filing an international patent application is you file first at the national level, and 12 months later you file your international patent application for the rest of the world. So what we see is really the consequence of decisions taken 12 months ago. So traditionally, we would see the slowdown coming in mainly in 2021. But this is the traditional picture of a recession. The current one, as I said, we don't know at this stage how deep this economic disruption and recession will be, and how long the crisis, indeed the current medical crisis, biological crisis, will last, and thus how significant the impact economically will be. What I can say and assure you is that we are very well placed financially to deal with this. So you saw our results for last year. 97 million, nearly 100 million surplus. And that has been the policy that we have followed for the last 10 years or more to build the financial stability of the organisation and to build the reserves and to build the liquid component of the reserves to enable us to continue operating even if our income is significantly reduced. So we are very well placed, but there is a big question mark that we all must wait and see what the financial impact is going to be. I think just a final word is that obviously we're all reflecting, and perhaps a bit too much, around the world, and we're all talking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and our first considerations, the health and safety of all human beings around the world, and and of our families and our loved ones. But beyond that, we have to keep functioning as a world. So I think some of the questions that are arising also are of a policy nature. I think it's far too early to make any reflections on this because we really are at the beginning in many respects of our understanding of the impact of this crisis. However, we are attentive to a few adjustments. For example, we've initiated a conversation with IP office heads and offices around the world on convergence in respect of extension of deadlines as a consequence of the emergency, so that applicants are not placed in a position where they have to comply with 2 months here, 6 months there, 3 months there, with a chaotic and transactionally expensive situation. Some countries are giving consideration to the liquidity crisis, especially for small and medium enterprises and startups. We are going to depend on startups and small and medium enterprises for innovation, or we do depend on them for a significant portion of innovation. And that innovation is going to be important in the regeneration economically that we hope to see coming out of this crisis. So some countries are thinking of delays or periods of grace for the payment of fees to facilitate the liquidity difficulties or to ease the liquidity difficulties that startups are facing, who are most vulnerable, and to ensure that what is often their most valuable asset, namely their intellectual asset, which is the innovation, is protected despite their lack of liquidity. So this is another sort of policy consideration of an immediate nature that we're looking at. Of course, many questions are going to be asked about access to medical supplies, access to medicines, and this is another major policy reflection which is almost certain to emerge from the current crisis, and where we're seeing activity at the national base level in many countries. As I said, I think at this stage it's premature to have any firm views about this matter. We're at the early stages of our understanding, but just to reassure you, we are reflecting on this and watching this with great attention and trying to stimulate an international discussion about some of the elements that we can see. So I have been perhaps a little long, but there's a large amount of territory to cover. I hope it has given you an idea of the very successful year that we had in 2019, of some of the challenges, the main challenges that we face in 2020, and of how we're dealing with the crisis provoked by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I wish you all safety and well-being, and keep safe and keep well, and to your loved ones as well. Thank you very much.